Well, a lot of the US arms trade to Israel is well known, as your reporter said. All the aircraft that, the fixed-wing combat aircraft that Israel uses in Gaza, the F-35s and F-16s, come from the US, along with a lot of the munitions. Since October 7th, the US has supplied, by December 1st, around 15,000 bombs and 57,000 artillery shells, according to media reports. That includes those 100 bunker buster bombs that Patrick was talking about. Israel, of course, produces a lot of its own arms. But, of course, the modern arms trade has a very wide and international supply chain. So a lot of companies and countries are involved in the production of aircraft like the F-16 and F-35. With the F-35, the stealth fighter, the UK in particular produces 15% of the value of every aircraft produced, including those that go to Israel. This includes things like the rear fuselage, a lot of electronic systems, the ejector seat, all sorts of subsystems. And we actually got, on a Freedom of Information request, a list of all the UK companies that are involved in this program. And it is dozens of companies that are involved. Now, we don't know if any new F-35s have been supplied since the war started, but combat aircraft, especially in an intense campaign like this, need a constant supply of spare parts. So undoubtedly, all the aircraft that Israel has is going to be continually needing new spares from all or most of these companies involved in this international supply chain.
I want to go to you now, Patrick. You touched on this a little bit before, but can you just give us a little bit of historical context? How does this compare? You mentioned Mosul, but how does this compare with other bombing campaigns that we have seen over the last few decades?
Well, yeah, Mosul was a direct comparison because in the first week of the Israeli response, they dropped more bombs, I think it was 6,000, than the US and its coalition partners dropped against ISIL in the Battle of Mosul in a month. And I think, and unfortunately for all those stuck in Gaza, it's a particularly, as I mentioned, densely populated, densely urbanized, and therefore more lethal environment. And as I mentioned again, this concept of proportionality, which is obviously, for example, I served in Afghanistan in the British Army, and in 2008, we were in a fairly rough place called Sangin, where we took a lot of casualties. And halfway through the tour, to stop civilian casualties, we weren't allowed to fire 81 millimeter mortars anymore. Now, they're fairly small in terms of lethality. We couldn't call in 105 millimeter guns. This is at an order of magnitude way below what Israel are using at the moment, in actually a situation which is relatively similar. It was a high-intensity counterinsurgency campaign. But again, as Secretary Lloyd said, what we were trying to do there was separate the insurgents, the narco-Taliban essentially, from the people as best we could. And the Israelis, this is completely lacking, as Colin mentioned. It's just creating a counter-terrorism nightmare, I would say, for the next...
To people who might not know exactly what they are, just how deadly and how widespread the destruction can be from just a single bunker bomb.
I'm not an expert on the precise lethality of different munitions, but these are, as we're told, 900 kilogram, 2,000 pound bombs. And so that is an enormous amount of destructive power in what, as our other panelists have said, is a very, very densely populated area. And we have seen cases like in Jabalia refugee camp, where a single strike has killed dozens, if not hundreds, of Palestinians at mostly civilians, in one go. We don't know if those bunker busters, but at any rate, the munitions that Israel is using are clearly big enough to cause such utterly devastating, totally disproportionate death and injury and destruction. And I would say, in response to what my colleagues here have been talking about, Israel, if Israel's goal is military victory over Hamas, their strategy doesn't make sense. But if, as several Israeli ministers and members of the Knesset have been saying, if their goal is to actually depopulate Gaza, to make the entire Gaza Strip unlivable and force the population into Egypt, then it kind of does make sense.
Okay. I guess because these are supplied by the United States, Patrick, I mean, it's giving Israel these weapons. Is the US explicitly endorsing their use? And then I guess if you take it a step further, is the US complicit in any civilians that are killed by the Israeli use of US weapons?
Yeah, well, just on the bunker buster thing. So usually when they do these weapons tests, they do it, if they're trying to work out lethality, they usually do them in the open, right? So it's obviously more lethal in an urbanized environment with buildings collapsing around you. But a bunker buster, normally, as far as I understand, depending on the payload, would have a lethal, what we call in the British military, a lethal blast area of at least 100 meters radius. So that's, draw that around to make out the diameter. So just on that, yeah, look, it's an interesting one. Clearly there's different, and Colin might be better, positioned to speak about the inside the Biden administration than me, but I think there's certainly different people pulling in different directions about what should be done here. Although Biden seems fairly clear that he's going to stay steadfast in his support for Israel. Certainly, the US has a lot of leverage here if it wanted to use it. And of course, where does it get its Iron Dome? Where does Israel get its Iron Dome missiles from, for example, to protect itself? Is the US. So I think the wheels would come off the wagon, although they do have an indigenous, big indigenous military industrial facilities. I think the wheels would come off the wagon in terms of the air campaign pretty quickly if America decided that enough was enough.
Right. Well, Colin, I will.
Right, because the United States is associated with this conflict. And if you look at the numbers dead, this is not something that's going to fade from the headlines. This is a moral stain on the United States. And so I think if the administration can wield influence, and we know that it has in the past, it needs to do so, and it needs to continue applying that pressure and not stop.
Sam, Amnesty International, sorry, Patrick, do you want to jump in there?
I was just going to jump in there. I think also, if this has been happening in Ukraine, and obviously terrible things have happened in Ukraine at the Russian hands in terms of Ukrainian civilians, but if this was happening in Ukraine, the Western condemnation would be much higher. And I think really you're looking at a position now where the war crimes thing should be put on the table and kept on the table. That if you cannot, that we will come after your lawyers and we will come after your targeting cells, and this should be backed by the Gulf states as well, who, for all intents and purposes, are still pretty quiet. They've been helping, some of them have been helping with the negotiations, but the general consensus seems to be to box this problem off as best they can and get on with, building their economies at the moment. So I think internationally more can be done.
Yeah. Okay, Sam, well, as we've seen in the last few days, Amnesty International put out a report saying that Israel does need to be investigated for possible war crimes. Is that something that you and your organisation agree with?
Absolutely. Of course, all war crimes, whether by Israel and Hamas, must be investigated. But there is overwhelming evidence that Israel has been committing war crimes. The blockade on food, water, fuel is itself a war crime. It is collective punishment, without doubt. Indeed, there's a case that what Israel's doing, and many international lawyers who know much more about it than me, that what Israel's doing can actually be classed as genocide. And the United States especially, but also UK, Germany and others that are arming Israel, can also potentially be in the dock for aiding and abetting war crimes by supplying these weapons, continuing to supply weapons and components in the full knowledge of what Israel has been doing and going to continue to do. And so the chances that Joe Biden would ever actually be arrested and brought to The Hague are vanishingly small.
Yes.
But I think that American officials, British officials, arms